Forget the Hollywood fantasies of polished sheriffs and well-dressed gamblers sipping whiskey in spotless saloons. The real Wild West was dusty, rowdy, and smelled like sweat, gunpowder, and beans. While the poker games and brawls might steal the spotlight, there's one gritty detail that often gets left out of the story: what people were actually eating in those smoky old saloons. Because behind every cowboy nursing a drink was a belly rumbling for something, anything to eat. And let's be honest, after a week on the trail, chewing leather and chasing cattle, even a plate of mystery stew started to look like fine dining. But here's the twist. The food served in Wild West saloons wasn't cooked up by expert chefs, or even decent cooks. More often than not, the kitchen was ruled by a grizzled, foul-tempered ex-miner, possibly drunk, probably grumpy, and definitely not winning any awards for hygiene. He wasn't cooking for pleasure, he was cooking for survival. Yours and his Dot. So, what was actually on the menu? Expect a lot of beans, bacon, and bread that could break your teeth. Meals were simple, hearty, and built to last in a world without refrigeration or health inspectors. Forget garnish. If it filled your gut and didn't kill you by morning, it was considered a success. In this video, we're diving deep into the smoky kitchens and soot-covered pots of the Wild West Saloon. We'll explore the everyday foods that fueled gold miners, gunslingers, cowhands, and drifters. From rock-hard hardtack to coffee that could strip paint, you'll get a taste, well, figuratively, of what mealtime was really like on the frontier. We'll also meet the unsung hero of the saloon kitchen, the cook, whose questionable hygiene and explosive temper made him both feared and essential. Sure, he might have been cooking with yesterday's bacon grease and this morning's hangover, but somehow he kept the beans boiling and the cowboys fed Dot. So grab your tin plate, pour yourself a cup of gritty black coffee, and saddle up, because you're about to find out what really got served at Wild West saloons. And trust us, it wasn't pretty, but it sure was unforgettable. Before you get comfortable, as always, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you enjoy our content. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories keep you up, other times they put you to sleep. Now let's begin. Beans were king. When you think of the Wild West, you probably imagine dusty streets, grizzled cowboys, swinging saloon doors, and the distant sound of a harmonica. Maybe you picture poker games going sour, gunfights erupting in the midday sun, or horses tied outside as their riders knock back whiskey inside. But beneath the sweat, spurs, and showdowns was something every cowboy cared about just as much as his six-shooter, food. And if there was one dish that ruled them all in saloons across the American frontier, it was beans. Not steak, not stew, not even whiskey-soaked jerky. Beans. Plain, humble, musical beans. Let's take a trip back to the 1800s and see what was really being served at those rough-and-tumble Wild West saloons, where a hot meal could be difference between life and death, or at least a punch in the face. The all-you-can-eat menu of beans. Why beans? Because they were cheap. They lasted forever. They were packed with protein, and you could cook them in a big pot and feed a dozen. Dusty travelers with one scoop apiece. Pinto beans, navy beans, and red beans were the top contenders, simmered slowly over campfires and wood stoves until they were soft enough to eat with your teeth half missing. Cowboys would stumble into a saloon after weeks on the trail, dreaming of steak, but fully expecting and accepting a bowl of beans. Sometimes they came with bacon, salt pork, or beef tallow stirred in for flavor. If the cook was generous or drunk, maybe you'd get a sprinkling of dried onion or chili powder. But most of the time, it was just beans. Saloons weren't just about booze, although saloons are remembered for booze and brothels. Many of them doubled as diners, or the closest thing to a restaurant that the frontier could offer. Especially in boom towns and mining camps, where men outnumbered women 50-1, and few people knew how to cook anything beyond put it in fire and hope it dies. A saloon meal was often the only hot food you'd eat all week. Some saloons advertised free food with the purchase of a drink. Others charged a small fee, say 10 or 15 cents, and served something warm from a pot out back. But food was always an afterthought. Plates? Optional. Cutlery? Maybe. Napkins? Don't be ridiculous. What else was on the menu? Beans might have been king, but they weren't the only thing making an appearance in those smoke-filled rooms. Depending on where you were and how fancy the place was, here's what you might have found. Sourdough bread. Every self-respecting frontier cook had a sourdough starter. This tangy, crusty bread was often served in thick hunks to mop up beans. And gravy. Salt pork or bacon. Salty, greasy, and shelf-stable, it was added to beans, slapped on bread, or just chewed plain if you were feeling primal. Stewed game. In areas with good hunting, you might score rabbit, deer, or even squirrel. Meat in a stew. Think tough meat in thin broth. Cornbread. Cheap, easy, and filling. Sometimes sweetened with molasses. Other times gritty and dry enough to scrape the roof of your mouth. Coffee, strong, black, and bitter as a saloon owner's heart. Grounds floating on top were normal. Sometimes eggshells or crushed beans were thrown in to settle it. Dried fruit or pie. Rare, but when it showed up, it disappeared fast. Apple and cherry pies made with dried fruit and sugar were a treat in some of the more established saloons. Mystery Meat Mondays. If the stew looked suspiciously dark, smelled like a barn, and had an unsettling crunch, you probably shouldn't ask questions. In many towns, meat was whatever the cook could get his hands on. That might mean wild animals, expired livestock, or in the worst cases, something the rat trap dragged in. Health codes didn't exist. Neither did refrigeration. A cowboy with an iron stomach could survive anything, but food poisoning was common, and dysentery was a near-weekly visitor. There's a reason whiskey was served with every meal. It wasn't just for fun. It was. Self-defense. The traveling chuckwagon versus the saloon kitchen out on the trail. Cowboys relied on chuckwagons, mobile kitchens that followed the herds and fed the wranglers. These served nearly identical fare: beans, bread, dried meat, and the occasional stew. But saloons had one big advantage: access to town suppliers. That meant canned goods, canned peaches, evaporated milk, and condensed soup were starting to make their way west thanks to railroad lines. These items were precious, but offered a rare break from the monotony of beans and more beans. Still, the chuckwagon had one thing going for it: Cookie, the cook. He was feared, loved, and obeyed. In a saloon, the cook was just some guy in a greasy apron. In a cattle drive camp, Cookie was God. Asterisk, a saloon kitchen was a fire hazard. Saloons weren't designed for gourmet experiences. Most had a back room with a wood stove, a couple of kettles, and a pile of ingredients that hadn't spoiled yet. Fires were a constant threat, and many towns burned to the ground at least once because someone knocked over a lantern while cooking. Pork fat. The kitchen might be shared with a barmaid, a piano player, and someone sleeping off their hangover. Sanitary? Not even close. But if you were hungry and had the coins, you didn't ask for Michelin stars. You just hoped the cook washed his hands, or at least didn't stir the beans with his fingers. Beans were also politics, believe it or not. Beans weren't just food. They were a cultural unifier. Whether you were a Mexican vaquero, a black cowboy, a Civil War veteran turned cattleman, or a Chinese rail worker stopping in for a quick bite, you all ate beans. In a land divided by class, color, and gunpowder, everyone sat at the same rough-hewn tables, and dug into the same bubbling pots of legumes. Sometimes you even got frijoles charros, cowboy beans, spicy and loaded with meat and chili peppers. Other times you got Boston-style baked beans, sweetened with molasses. But no matter where you came from, the meal was familiar. Food fights were real, and sometimes deadly. Meals didn't always go peacefully. Arguments over the last pork scrap, stolen cornbread, or a spoiled batch of beans could turn into full-blown brawls. Knives came out, chairs flew. More than one cowboy got shot because he insulted the cook. Don't mess with the guy making. Your beans became an unspoken law. And if the food was bad, you ate it anyway. Complaining could earn you a black eye or a ban from the only joint in town that had a roof and warm grub. A shot of whiskey with that? Every saloon served alcohol, and many offered it with the food as part of a meal deal, years before fast food chains caught on. For a dime, you might get beans, bread, and a shot of rot-gut whiskey. If you were lucky, you didn't go blind. Some saloons even brewed their own beer or kept barrels of wine, mostly awful. But whiskey was the drink of choice. It was easier to transport, didn't spoil easily, and was strong enough to kill whatever bacteria just entered your gut with that bean stew. Asterisk. Goodbye, gourmet. Hello, grit. The idea of fine dining in the Wild West was laughable. There were no menus, no tablecloths, and definitely no vegan options. You ate what they had or went hungry. And what they had, almost always, was beans. Beans represented everything about the Wild West. Survival, simplicity, toughness, and a surprising amount of musical flatulence. They filled bellies, quieted tempers, and reminded every drifter and desperado that out here, comfort food came in a tin cup with a side of grit. Would you eat at a Wild West saloon? Imagine walking into a smoky saloon after a week on the trail. Your lips are cracked, your boots are full of dust, and the smell of beans wafts through the swinging doors. The barkeep nods. You slap down a coin. A plate appears. Beans, bread, maybe a hunk of meat if you're lucky. You don't ask questions. You don't check the expiration date. You dig in, grateful to be warm, fed, and alive. Because in the Wild West, that's all that really mattered. And maybe, just maybe, you ask for seconds. Because as every cowboy knew, beans were king. Steak, if you were lucky. The Hollywood lie. Saloons full of sizzling steaks and whiskey shots. If you've ever watched a classic Western movie, you probably think the Wild West was all about whiskey-soaked poker games, tough guys slapping steaks, onto iron skillets, and saloon girls serving piping hot meals to gun-slinging cowboys. And sure, maybe once in a while, someone did get a steak, but only if they were lucky, rich, or very persuasive. The truth? Saloon food in the Wild West was often greasy, questionable, and downright terrifying. Forget your dreams of medium-rare ribeyes and buttery mashed potatoes. Most folks were just trying to survive on a sad menu of beans, bread, and maybe some mystery meat if it didn't smell too off. So buckle up your saddle. Here's what was really on the menu at Wild West saloons, and why that steak was more. Myth and main course. Beans. The unofficial mascot of the Wild West menu. Let's get one thing straight. Beans were everywhere. Cowboys ate beans for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Saloons stocked them because they were cheap, didn't spoil easily, and could be cooked in massive batches to feed hungry drifters. Pinto beans, navy beans, black beans, take your pick. Usually simmered in big pots over open flames, they were sometimes flavored with a bit of pork fat or bacon if available. But most of the time, they were just plain, sometimes even burnt, and served with a hunk of dry bread or hardtack. So yes, if you sat down at a saloon table and the barkeep yelled, "Beans or nothing?" You knew which one was the safe bet. Bread, biscuits, and hardtack. Carb loading. Cowboy-style frigate, fluffy dinner rolls, or warm sourdough. Bred in the wild. West was functional. Saloon kitchens often served hard biscuits, or what was called hardtack, rock-solid cracker that could break a tooth if not soaked in something first. Saloons closer to railroads or cities might have slightly better options. Skillet cornbread, sourdough loaves, or even flaky biscuits if someone's grandma was running the kitchen. But mostly, it was flour, water, and salt, baked until it could survive the apocalypse. Cowboys dumped this stuff in their coffee just to soften it enough to chew mystery meat Mondays, and Tuesdays. And every day here's where things get dicey. Meat was expensive in the frontier, and even when available, it wasn't always fresh or recognizable. You might find some salted pork or dried beef jerky on offer. But steaks? Real, sizzling, cow-sourced steaks? Those were rare. They were a luxury reserved for the rich, the lucky, or those willing to gamble their gold dust for it. More often, meat served in saloons was whatever the hunter dragged in. That could mean rabbit, squirrel, or even prairie dog. In mining towns, rumors swirled about dog meat, or even worse. If it could be stewed, salted, or disguised with gravy, it made it to the plate. Steak night? A dream. If the sign said steak special, you better ask what kind of animal they meant. Coffee that could strip paint coffee was a cowboy's lifeblood. Strong, black, and made in giant pots over open fires, it was served in nearly every saloon. But don't expect artisanal brews or fresh ground beans. Most of the time, the grounds were reused multiple times. Some saloons threw in eggshells or bits of lard to settle the grounds. And the result? Something that resembled oil more than coffee, and tasted like it too. Still, cowboys drank it by the gallon. It kept them awake, warmed their bones, and gave them something to swish around after chewing through that week-old biscuit. Whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was dinner. Let's be real. A lot of folks in saloons weren't there for the food. They were there for the booze. Whiskey was everywhere, and sometimes it was safer to drink than water. Not that it was good. Saloon whiskey was often homemade, cut with turpentine, or mixed with gunpowder to give it kick. But to the exhausted, trail-worn cowboy or miner, a slug of whiskey was a meal in itself. Sometimes it even came with a free plate of food if you bought enough shots. That's right. In some towns, buying a few drinks got you access to the free lunch table, stocked with salty sausages, stale bread, and vinegar-heavy pickles. Why salty food? To make you buy more whiskey, of course. Canned goods. Fancy, expensive, and questionably edible if a saloon was well-stocked and well-connected. It might serve some canned food. Canned peaches, tomatoes, sardines, and condensed milk were status. Symbols. They traveled a long way by rail or ship and cost a small fortune, but they didn't always taste great. Early cans were soldered with lead, and explosions from spoiled tins weren't unheard of. Still, a spoonful of canned peaches in. A saloon could feel like fine dining compared to beans and biscuits. Some upscale. Saloons would even offer canned oysters or salmon. Again, it all depended on whether your town was booming or barely surviving. Eggs and bacon, a gold rush fantasy eggs. And bacon became mythical in the West. They were the kind of breakfast food that made men weep with joy, because it was so rare. Chickens weren't common on the frontier, too hard to care for. And pigs were even harder to raise without being stolen or eaten first. That meant eggs and bacon had to be shipped in or reserved for the wealthy. If you stumbled into a saloon and saw eggs on the menu, you were probably in a mining moontown during its peak, and you probably paid through the nose for it. Chuckwagon vs. Saloon. Who fed you better? It's worth noting that cowboys didn't always eat at saloons. If you were part of a cattle drive or working on a ranch, you'd eat from the chuck wagon, a rolling kitchen run by the cook or cookie. Surprisingly, chuck wagon food could be more consistent than saloon fare. Sure, it was still beans, biscuits, and salted meat, but at least you knew the cook, and the ingredients were usually fresh. Plus, the coffee was often better. Saloons, on the other hand, had to make money. Food was cheap, fast, and questionably edible. Unless a saloon had a reputation to maintain, food was an afterthought. Local ingredients: buffalo, trout, and wild game sometimes. Geography determined your dinner. In the Rockies, you might get some fresh trout from the stream. On the plains, buffalo steaks if you were really lucky and someone had just done a successful hunt. In desert regions, you might see prickly pear cactus served as a side dish or fried wild onions on the menu. Saloons used what was available, and when settlers brought farming with them, things improved slightly. But the Wild West menu was always at the mercy of location, luck, and livestock. So, was steak ever real? Yes, steaks did exist in the Wild West. Cattle ranching was booming by the late 1800s. In cities like Dodge City or Abilene, you could absolutely walk into a saloon and order a juicy slab of beef. But that was the exception, not the rule. Most frontier towns couldn't afford fresh meat daily. Without refrigeration, steaks spoiled fast. Even salted or smoked versions had limits. So, while the idea of a cowboy sitting down to a sizzling steak makes for great TV, most meals were simpler and sadder. Hence the phrase, steak if you were lucky. It was rough, but it filled the belly. Saloon food in the Wild West was never about luxury. It was survival cuisine, cheap, filling, and just enough to keep you upright for the next day's ride. Beans were king. Bread was hard. Meat was questionable. And coffee was better used as boot polish. But in those smoky, chaotic saloons, food was also part of a larger experience. It was served alongside music, dancing, gambling, and fights. It wasn't five-star dining, but it had character, grit, and the kind of hunger-driven charm that made a bowl of beans feel like a feast. So the next time you grill a perfect steak, raise a glass to the Wild West saloon diners who made do with less and probably paid more for it. Because in the Wild West, food wasn't just about taste. It was about survival. Coffee was like mud. If you ever time traveled back to a dusty old saloon in Tombstone, Dodge City, or Deadwood, your taste buds would probably stage a mutiny. The Wild West has been immortalized in pop culture as a place of shootouts, gambling, and whiskey-fueled brawls, but very little attention is paid to the food. And trust us, there's a reason for that. Because when cowboys and drifters sauntered into those wooden establishments looking for a bite and a cup of joe, they weren't exactly walking into a five-star establishment. The food was rough. The meat was questionable. And the coffee? Well, it was more like muddy swamp water than the smooth caramel brew you sip today. Let's break down the gritty, greasy, and often gruesome meals served up at Wild West saloons, and why you'd probably spit your drink right back into your tin cup. Asterisk that infamous cup of mud first. Let's talk about the beverage that started it all. Coffee. Calling it coffee is generous. This stuff was brewed from whatever beans the saloon keeper could get his dusty hands on, often low quality, stale, or even recycled grounds. Clean water wasn't guaranteed, so saloon coffee frequently came with a side of floating grit, ash, or leftover food particles. The pot would sit over a fire all day, being topped off with more grounds and more water in a sort of percolating purgatory. Cowboys didn't sip. It was more like gulp and wince. It was thick, bitter, and black as a horse's hoof. But it was warm, had caffeine, and didn't kill you. Usually. Beans. Beans and more beans if you ever wondered what the protein of choice was. It wasn't steak or ribs or juicy chicken. It was beans. Dried beans were cheap, easy to store, and could survive the long, hot rides from distant suppliers. They were soaked overnight and then boiled into a lumpy paste or stew. The result was filling, but monotonous. You'd find beans for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Pinto, navy, or kidney, doesn't matter. They were often salted within an inch of their lives, just to make them palatable. Add in a chunk of fatback or a sprinkle of mystery meat, and that was your cowboy chili. Let's just say nobody was sneaking a second, helping for the taste. Meat was at Gamble Meat was available, but fresh was not always part of the equation. In cities, saloons might offer steak or pork chops if the delivery wagon made it in on time and the cook hadn't already burned it. In rural frontier towns, the meat could be anything from jackrabbit to squirrel, raccoon, or even snake. If it walked, crawled, or flew and could be shot, it was fair game literally. Sometimes it was dried into jerky. Sometimes it was thrown into a pot and called stew. But identifying the species in your stew was optional. Diners had to eat with more trust than taste. And refrigeration? Forget it. Salt and smoke were the main preservatives. That meant your steak might be a week past its prime and buzzing with flies. It might be chewy, stringy, or gamey, a polite way of saying it tastes weird, but let's not talk about it. Bread that could break your teeth didn't imagine. Soft dinner rolls and warm sourdough. The bread in Wild West saloons was often hardtack, a kind of survival biscuit that could last months without spoiling. It was made with flour, water, and salt, then baked until it was tough as a boot. If a saloon offered fresh bread, it was usually cornbread or a pan-fried soda bread, cooked over open flames. These could still be dense and dry, often requiring a generous pour of gravy or coffee mud just to choke it down. Teeth were the real victims here. Many cowboys cracked a molar or two on this frontier fare. Mystery stews and everything in the pot. One-pot meals were a staple in saloon kitchens. These stews, often called slumgullion, were a chaotic mix of whatever ingredients were lying around. Beans? Check. Scraps of meat? Yep. Old carrots, half onion, a sprig of something greenish from the garden? Toss it in. The flavor? Somewhere between burnt and boiled sock. But the real magic was in the inconsistency. One day, it might taste halfway decent. The next, it might taste like the cook used saddle leather and gunpowder, and asking what's in it was frowned upon. You didn't want to know. Eggs, if you were lucky eggs, were a frontier luxury. Chickens were tough to keep safe from predators, and even tougher to transport. So if a saloon had eggs, they charged for them like gold. They might be served scrambled or fried in lard, and often cooked until rubbery or scorched. Omelets? Forget it. This wasn't Paris. But if you saw eggs on a hand-painted saloon menu, you knew you were dealing with a place that had connections or a hen that hadn't been stolen yet. Cheap whiskey and harsh pickles alcohol counts as calories, right? Whiskey was the drink of choice, though what passed as whiskey was often homemade, unaged, and potent enough to power a steam engine. It burned like fire and could be used to clean wounds or start them. Some saloons served pickled eggs, pickled vegetables, or even pickled pig's feet in jars behind the bar. These were salty, sour, and strangely beloved, partly because vinegar helped kill off anything too dangerous. They also made you thirsty, so you ordered more whiskey. Clever business. Desserts were practically urban legends, if a saloon cook had the time, ingredients, and energy. You might get an apple pie or a molasses cookie. But don't count on it. Sugar was expensive, milk spoiled, and eggs, as we said, were rare. So desserts were mostly for special occasions, like if a shipment had just arrived, or the town was celebrating a hanging. Molasses, dried fruit, or lard might show up in basic puddings, but the sweetness was minimal. You didn't go to a saloon to satisfy your sweet tooth. You went to survive dinner. Cooks were gunslingers in their own right. Saloon cooks weren't chefs, they were survivors. Often ex-miners, ex-cons, or widows down on their luck. They did what they could with what they had. They cooked over open flames or rusty stoves, in cramped kitchens filled with smoke. They fended off rats, dealt with spoiled goods, and had to stretch supplies across a dozen hungry cowhands and a poker table full of grifters. And yet, they kept the food coming no matter how terrifying it looked. You complained about the food? You got nothing next time. Or worse, special stew made just for you. You ate what you got, or you went hungry at the end of the day. Saloon food wasn't about flavor. It was about fuel. Cowboys, prospectors, gamblers, and drifters needed calories to keep moving, working, or fighting. Whether it came from a greasy plate of beans or a crusty lump of bread didn't matter. Nobody asked for a menu. There wasn't one, and you didn't send anything back to the kitchen because you might get a boot in the backside instead. The aftertaste of frontier dining, so could you stomach a Wild West meal? Probably not. Modern diners, raised on lattes and avocado toast, would weep into their tin mugs at the sight of a crusty plate of charred squirrel stew and scorched beans. And that muddy coffee? One sip would send you straight back to Starbucks. But in the rough-and-tumble world of the American frontier, food wasn't about luxury. It was about scraping by, sharing meals with strangers, and surviving until the next sunrise got. So here's to the saloon cooks, the bean boilers, and the brave souls who drank mud and called it coffee dot, because in the Wild West, dinner wasn't just a meal, it was an act of courage. Chili was a favorite. When you picture the Wild West, your mind probably jumps to dusty streets, duels at high noon, swinging saloon doors, and cowboys with swagger. But while gunfights and whiskey get most of the screen time, there was another fire burning in those raucous saloons, and it wasn't in the hearth. It was in the bowls of chili that kept miners, outlaws, cowhands, and drifters warm, fed, and full of steam. Chili wasn't just a favorite food in Wild West saloons. It was a survival dish, a point of pride, and sometimes the only thing hot, hearty, and spicy enough to keep you coming back. Let's saddle up and ride through the history, culture, and downright peculiar flavors of this beloved frontier staple. A one-pot wonder for one-horse towns in a time when ingredients were scarce, cooking was rustic, and appetites were ravenous. Chili made perfect sense. It was the ultimate one-pot meal, easy to prepare in bulk, cheap, and flavorful enough to cover up. Less than fresh ingredients. Whether you were a saloon cook with a shaky supply chain or a trail-weary cowboy with a cast-iron pot and a few spices, chili was the answer. Toss in some dried chilies, beans, whatever meat you could find, onions if you were lucky, and boom, you had a bowl of something that could warm your belly and clear your sinuses. And it stuck to your ribs. As they used to say, perfect fuel for cowboys spending 12 hours in the saddle, or prospectors swinging pickaxes in the baking sun. Asterisk. No two bowls were alike. There was no such thing as authentic chili in the Old West. Every saloon had its own recipe. Every cook their own flair. In some towns, it came packed with beef. In others, you'd find rattlesnake or jackrabbit. Some versions used dried beans. Others swore that beans were the devil's filler. Some were tomato-heavy, while others kept it bone-dry and spicy as hell. One thing was certain. Chili was not fancy food. You weren't eating it with a silver spoon. You were hunched over a dented tin bowl at a scarred wooden table, surrounded by the smells of sweat, cigars, beer, and gun oil, slurping it down with a hunk of bread if you were lucky, or cornbread. If the cook was in a generous mood, chili queens and open-air kitchens before chili made it big in saloons. It had a royal beginning, at least in name. In San Antonio, Texas, chili queens ruled the night markets during the mid-1800s. These women, many of Mexican descent, cooked huge pots of chili con carne and served it at open-air stands to soldiers, settlers, and drunks coming off a bender. Their chili was rich, peppery, and laced with Mexican spices. They garnished bowls with tortillas and sass, serving with a wink and a joke. It wasn't long before their recipes spread far and wide, hopping from frontier markets into saloon kitchens across Texas, New Mexico, and beyond. In many ways, it was the chili queens who ignited the chili craze that would soon sweep across. The West. The poor man's stew, and the drunkard's dream. Chili was the saloon cook's best friend. It was inexpensive, could simmer for hours, and didn't require high-end ingredients, mostly because no one had any. When the meat was a little old or the beans weren't quite done, who cared? A healthy dose of chili peppers could hide all sins. And if the patrons were already half lit on whiskey, even better. They weren't looking for gourmet, they wanted hot, spicy, and filling. Chili fit the bill. Some saloons offered free chili to paying drinkers, knowing full well it would keep customers sitting longer and ordering more booze. Others charged a nickel or dime for a heaping bowl still a steal. For a meal that could carry a man through the night. What's in this? You might not want to know. There's a long-running joke that chili in the Wild West was a mystery meat special. And it wasn't always a joke. When supplies ran low, saloon cooks got creative or desperate. There are confirmed accounts of chili made with everything from prairie, dog and squirrel to armadillo and snake. Some less savory rumors claim that when meat got truly scarce, anything was fair game. Let's just say, if you didn't ask too many questions about what was floating in your bowl, you slept easier. But even the roughest batches could be made. Palatable with the right blend of spices come in, garlic, dried chilies, maybe even a pinch of oregano. Chili was the art of making something from nothing. And that's exactly what life on the frontier was all about. The competition gets heated in larger towns like Dodge City or Tombstone, where multiple saloons jostled for business. Chili often became a point of pride. One cook might brag that his chili was hotter than a $2 pistol, while another swore his had bite enough to put hair on your horse. Some even held impromptu chili-offs, inviting locals and travelers to sample bowls and declare a winner. There were no trophies, just bragging rights, a lot of sweating, and sometimes a free drink for the cook with the most scorched tongues. Chili and whiskey. A love-hate relationship if there was one thing more popular than chili in Wild West saloons. It was whiskey. But put the two together, and things could get ... explosive. The problem? Spicy chili and bottom-shelf whiskey didn't always mix well. Some poor souls would chase a mouthful of blazing hot chili with a swig of cheap booze and promptly end up either flat on the floor or sprinting for the outhouse. Still, that didn't stop folks from doing it. Many actually believed the burn was good for the body, sweating out fever, clearing lungs, or killing off bad spirits. Frontier medicine wasn't exactly scientific, but hey, if it worked. Canned chili and the beginning of the end. By the late 1800s, companies started selling canned chili, which spread like wildfire across the American frontier. It was portable, shelf-stable, and convenient, especially for saloons in remote towns. One of the most famous brands, Wolf brand chili, launched in the 1890s. Soon, canned chili could be found in railroad cars, general stores, and even brothels. While some purists turned up their noses at the idea, others embraced it. It meant less work, consistent flavor, and fewer questionable meat choices. The rise of canned chili signaled a shift away from home-cooked grit and toward modern convenience. But even then, the love for chili never died. Chili lives on even as the West was tamed. Railroads spread, and saloons gave way to diners and restaurants. Chili never left the American soul. Today, it's a national treasure, with cook-offs, chili festivals, and 1,000 regional variants from Texas no-bean purist bowls to Cincinnati's cinnamon-kissed chili on spaghetti. But the spirit of those old saloon bowls still lingers. Every spoonful of smoky, spicy, slow-cooked chili is a bite of the frontier hot, unpredictable, a little dangerous, and absolutely unforgettable. A saloon without chili, unthinkable dot in a world where meals were measured by how long they kept. You on your feet, chili reigned supreme. It was a badge of honor for a saloon to have a damn fine chili, and patrons came to expect it. It didn't matter if the poker game was rigged, or the whiskey watered down if the chili was good. The saloon had a fighting chance. So next, time you're sitting down with a steaming bowl. Tip your hat to the dusty cooks, the chili queens, and the grizzled cowboys who made chili not just a dish, but a legend. Because in the Wild West, chili wasn't just a favorite. It was survival. It was comfort. It was fire in a bowl. And if it made your eyes water and your mouth burn, well, partner, that just meant it was done right. Bread was usually hardtack. When you think of the Wild West, you probably picture shootouts, dusty towns, and outlaws with names like Snake Eyes Bill or One-Eyed Pete. But in between gambling, whiskey, and the occasional barroom brawl, people had to eat. And if you wandered into one of those rickety old saloons hoping for a fresh, buttery biscuit, you were in for a rude awakening. Because more often than not, bread came in the form of something that could break your teeth. Hardtack. That's right, one. Of the most common breads served at Wild West saloons wasn't soft, fluffy, or even warm. It was dry, rock hard, practically fossilized. But it kept well, filled your belly, and didn't go moldy, so it became a saloon staple. Welcome to the gritty world of frontier food. What in the world is hardtack? Let's start with the basics. Hardtack is a simple cracker or biscuit made of flour, water, and sometimes a bit of salt. That's it. No yeast, no butter, no love. Once mixed and baked, it turns into something about as appetizing as a paving stone. In fact, it earned nicknames like tooth dollars, sheet iron, and even molar breakers. Originally a staple in naval and military diets for centuries, hardtack found new life out west, where refrigeration was non-existent, and food had to survive long journeys and unpredictable climates. It could last for months or even years if stored properly. That's why saloons and frontier eateries kept it on hand. Why was hardtack so popular in the Wild West? The Wild West was not exactly a culinary paradise. Transportation was slow, supplies were limited, and fresh ingredients were scarce. Saloons weren't just places to drink. They were community hubs, sometimes doubling as hotels, general stores, or even post offices. And they had to serve food that didn't spoil and could be made in bulk. Enter hardtack. Cheap, durable, and practically indestructible. Unlike soft breads, which needed yeast, skill, and decent ovens, hardtack was easy to produce on a wood stove or campfire. Saloon keepers could make stacks of the stuff, throw it in a barrel, and forget about it. But just because it was everywhere doesn't mean people liked it. Just dip it in coffee, you'll be fine. Hardtack was often so hard that you couldn't bite into it without softening it first. Cowboys and gold miners learned to soak it in coffee, stew, or even whiskey just to make it edible. Some would break it into smaller chunks with the butt of a revolver. Others used rocks or axe heads to crack it open like a nut. You know it's bad when your bread needs to be bludgeoned before breakfast. Despite its poor reputation, though, hardtack kept bellies full. In a place where fresh eggs were a luxury and bacon could cost as much as a silver coin, The bland, dry biscuit had its place. What else was served alongside hardtack? If you're picturing a meal of just hardtack and a shot of rot-gut whiskey, you're not far off, but there were other options too. Here's what your average Wild West saloon might have on the menu. 1. Beans, lots of them, if hardtack was the bread. Beans were the butter. Cheap, filling, and long-lasting, beans were boiled into oblivion in giant iron pots. Baked beans, chili beans, or just plain pinto beans cowboys practically lived on them. Add a little salt pork if you were lucky. 2. Salt pork or jerky meat was expensive and hard to store, so preserved options were common. Salt pork was heavily cured, salty, and greasy. Jerky was tough, dry, and smoky, basically meat that had been hardtack feed. Again, dipping helped. 3. Coffee. That could strip paint. The coffee at Wild West saloons was legendary, and not in a good way. It was often made from reused grounds, overboiled to the point of bitterness, and strong enough to wake the dead. But when you're stuck chewing on hardtack, you'd welcome anything with. 4. Stews and slop. Some saloons offered stews often made from dubious cuts of meat and leftover vegetables. These stews were greasy and vague in flavor, but they made for a hearty dip for your hardtack. Mystery meat? Maybe, but it was hot, and that counted for something. 5. Oysters. Wait, what? Believe it or not, some fancier saloons in rail-connected towns served canned oysters. While this sounds bizarre, oysters were one of the earliest canned foods, and upper-class patrons expected them. So yes, you might have oyster stew and hardtack if you were rolling in gold dust. The hardtack horror stories, let's not sugarcoat. Hardtack had a reputation for being disgusting and dangerous. There are reports from soldiers and pioneers alike of hardtack crawling with weevils, a type of tiny beetle. You'd tap the biscuit to shake the bugs out, then eat it anyway. Some folks joked that the weevils added protein. Others were just glad they didn't chip a tooth. In especially bad conditions, hardtack could grow mold if stored poorly or become so rock-like that it could be used as a weapon. One tale even claims a cowboy threw a piece of hardtack during a poker dispute and knocked a man clean off his chair. Homemade hardtack, cowboy cooking at its simplest. Despite its legendary blandness, hardtack was sometimes made from scratch in saloon kitchens or chuck wagons. Here's how they did it. Mix 2 cups flour plus 1/2 cup water plus a pinch of salt. Knead it into a dough. Roll it out. Cut into squares. Poke holes with a fork to prevent puffing. Bake. At a low heat for hours until completely dry. The result? A cracker that could outlive you. In the modern world, hardtack is sometimes made by survivalists or history buffs, but most people today wouldn't dream of calling it bread. Still, it served its purpose, and out west, purpose often mattered. More than pleasure. Asterisk, not all bread was hardtack, but most wasn't much better. In some rare cases, especially in more developed towns or rail hubs, saloons and hotels served sourdough bread or cornbread. Sourdough was favored by miners and bakers alike because it didn't require commercial yeast. It created its own. Cornbread, made from local cornmeal, was quicker and easier to make than traditional wheat bread, but these were exceptions. For most saloons, especially the ramshackle ones on the frontier, the standard remained unchanged. Dry, durable, depressingly dull. Hardtack. The role of hardtack in cowboy culture. Hardtack wasn't just food, it was part of the lifestyle. Cowboys, scouts, and soldiers learned to live with it. They joked about it, traded it, and even wrote poems about it. It became a symbol of endurance. It meant you were tough enough to eat something that could shatter glass. In a world where bullets flew, dust storms raged, and the nearest doctor might be 3 days away, hardtack was almost comforting. You knew what you were getting. Bland, dry, and solid. At least hardtack didn't lie. Would you eat it? Today, we live in an age of sourdough starters, brioche buns, and croissants with layers of buttery joy. So the idea of sitting down in a saloon, nursing a chipped mug of black coffee, and gnawing on a stale square of hardtack sounds, well, medieval dot, but that's the reality of Wild West dining. Saloons weren't gourmet kitchens. They were practical, gritty, and resourceful, just like the people who walked through their swinging doors. So the next time you bite into a warm roll or a crusty baguette, take a moment to think about the cowboys, miners, and travelers of the 1800s. They didn't have much, but they had hardtack. And whether they liked it or not, bread was usually hardtack, the crunchiest, toughest, most unyielding reminder that the West wasn't just wild. It was hard. If you were in a Wild West saloon, you weren't munching on fresh ciabatta. You were gnawing on hardtack, a rock-solid biscuit made from flour and water. It was cheap, durable, and about as pleasant as eating a floor tile. Paired with beans, jerky, or coffee that tasted like despair, it kept pioneers alive. And in the rough-and-tumble world of the frontier, survival mattered more than flavor. Eggs and bacon a treat. When you think of the Wild West, luxury probably isn't the first word that comes to mind. Life on the frontier was brutal, filled with dust, danger, and more beans than any human being should have to eat. The meals were often as rugged as the cowboys themselves. Tough meat, questionable stews, and bread so hard you could use it as a weapon. But every now and then, in the smoky back room of a saloon or the kitchen of a frontier boarding house, something magical would hit the plate. Eggs and bacon. It was more than breakfast. It was a treat. You had to be lucky to find it in a world where beans ruled and meat was mostly salted beyond recognition. Finding eggs and bacon on the menu was like stumbling across gold dust. These weren't everyday items, especially in remote settlements miles from the nearest farm. Chickens didn't exactly thrive in dusty cattle towns. Pigs required feed, hens, and protection from wolves, rustlers, and starvation. So when eggs and bacon were available, people noticed. Whether you were a worn-out cowboy, a gambler down on his luck, or a saloon girl between shifts, a plate of hot eggs and bacon meant one thing. Today was your lucky day. Bacon, the salty gold of the frontier. If you were lucky enough to find bacon in a saloon, odds are it was salt-cured or smoked and shipped in from somewhere much greener than where you were standing. The most common variety was called side pork, which is where bacon comes from, but less refined, and usually much fattier. It came in slabs, not strips. A saloon cook would slice it off with a rusty knife, slap it into a cast-iron skillet, and let it crackle and spit until it curled like a scorpion's tail. Cowboys loved the sound and smell of bacon cooking. It meant protein, grease, and a flavor strong enough to mask everything else on the plate, especially if the eggs weren't exactly fresh. Eggs were a gamble. Getting eggs to a saloon wasn't easy. Hens didn't thrive in desert towns filled with drunk gunslingers and bar fights. And transporting eggs over bumpy wagon roads? That was a recipe for scrambled yolk. Eggs were fragile, expensive, and highly prized. Some towns had local farms, or chicken coops behind the boarding house, but many relied on preserved versions like powdered eggs, or even pickled eggs. Yes, pickled eggs. You'd see them floating in cloudy jars behind the bar, staring at you like pale eyeballs as you drank your whiskey. But the real prize was a fried egg, fresh from the skillet, yolk golden and wobbly, edges crisp with bacon grease. That's what made it a treat. It didn't happen every day. Breakfast wasn't just for mornings in the Wild West. The concept of a breakfast hour was a joke. Cowboys rose before dawn, worked through lunch, and might not eat a real meal until sunset. Saloons stayed open late, sometimes all night, and served food whenever someone had the coin for it. That meant eggs and bacon weren't limited to morning hours. In fact, they were often considered a recovery meal. After a long night of drinking, gambling, or breaking up brawls, a hot plate of eggs and bacon was like a hangover cure before anyone knew what that term meant. Grease, salt, and protein, frontier medicine at its finest. The smell that stopped you in your tracks. Picture this. You're walking down a dusty street in a mining camp, your boots kicking up clouds, your stomach growling after a week of boiled beans and rock-hard bread. Then you catch it a smell, smoky, savory, with just a hint of sizzle in the air. Bacon. You follow your nose to the saloon's back door, where a crusty old cook is flipping bacon and cracking eggs into a skillet the size of a wagon wheel. A line's already formed. Cowboys, gamblers, prospectors, all willing to pay extra for something that rare and delicious. And when your turn comes, it's worth every cent. Eggs and bacon were for winners in gambling towns like Deadwood or Dodge City. It wasn't uncommon for saloons to reward a big poker winner with a winner's breakfast. What was on the plate? You guessed it. Eggs and bacon. Maybe some bread. Maybe a splash of whiskey in your coffee. But always eggs and bacon. If you were down on your luck, you might be begging for stale biscuits. But if you hit a flush on the river or sold a bag of gold dust, you were living large. And nothing said, "I made it in a frontier town," quite like a plate of hot eggs. Bacon, grease, the Wild West super ingredient in saloon kitchens. Nothing was wasted, especially bacon. Grease. After the bacon was cooked, the leftover fat was used for everything. Frying eggs, cooking potatoes, greasing pans, or even shining boots. It was liquid gold, rich in flavor and calories. Cooks would store it in tin cans or old whiskey bottles, ready to pour at a moment's notice. And it gave everything that unmistakable taste, smoky, salty, and slightly dangerous. Eggs fried in bacon grease were often the highlight of the week, if not the month. Sometimes it came with extras if you stumbled into a better stocked saloon, say, one near a railroad stop or a large town. You might get lucky and find some. Extras with your eggs and bacon. Fried potatoes, crispy bits of potato fried in, you guessed it, bacon grease, cornbread or sourdough toast, a wedge of baked bread to mop up the yolk. Gravy, not the silky kind we know today. This was flour and fat stirred until thick, poured over whatever was on the plate, stewed tomatoes or beans, because some habits die hard. Even on breakfast plates. Saloon kitchens were chaos. Behind the swinging doors and poker tables, saloon kitchens were small, smoky, and chaotic. There were no fancy tools, no timers or thermometers, just cast iron, open flames, and hope. A single cook might be feeding 30 hungry mouths using 2 pans and whatever ingredients hadn't spoiled yet. Eggs and bacon required timing, and in a place where gunfights could break out over a lost card game, timing wasn't always on your side. But the cooks made it work. And when the plates hit the table hot and sizzling, there was silence, the kind that only comes from pure, greasy satisfaction. Saloons knew eggs and bacon were good business owners. Of saloons quickly learned that offering eggs and bacon, even just occasionally, brought in the crowds. Advertisements might read, "Hot breakfast served all day. Eggs, bacon, coffee minus 25 cents. Was that expensive? For the time, yes. But it was also irresistible. Word would spread, and within hours, the stools were full, whiskey was flowing, and cards were flipping. A good meal kept customers happy, or at least too full to start trouble. Cowboys remembered the meal for weeks after they rode off into the plains again. Cowboys didn't dream of gold or glory. They dreamed of that one time in Laramie or Tombstone when they got to eat hot bacon and fresh eggs. Meals like that were rare, and they lived on in stories told around the campfire. Remember that saloon down in Abilene? One might say, with the bacon so crisp you could snap it in half, and the yolk so yellow it looked like the sun? Best meal I ever had. The others would nod dot, and they meant it. Asterisk, a frontier feast, remember eggs and bacon, weren't just food. They were a sign of hope, a reminder that the Wild West had more to offer than dust and danger. They were a reward, a comfort, a touch of civilization in an untamed world. You might go days or weeks without a bath, a soft bed, or clean clothes, but when that sizzling plate slid across a saloon counter, it made you feel almost human again, Dot. So the next time you dig into your modern breakfast, eggs, bacon, toast. On the side, think of the cowboys who walked miles, faced rattlesnakes and rustlers, and stared down bar brawls just to get the same. Because out in the Wild West, eggs and bacon were more than a meal. They were a treat. Game meat on the menu. Welcome to dinner in the Wild West. You walk into a dusty saloon, spurs clinking, hat low, and stomach growling. The room smells like tobacco, sweat, whiskey, and something cooking over a fire. The barkeep grunts without looking up. Game meat stew today, if you're hungry. That might sound rustic and charming, but let's be clear. If you were eating game meat in a Wild West saloon, you weren't dining on gourmet elk fillet and pan-seared quail breast. You were likely chewing through something sinewy, heavily seasoned to mask the smell, and possibly still twitching. Back in the 1800s, saloon kitchens had to work with whatever the land or the trapper could provide. Fresh beef was a luxury. Pork was rare. Chickens were walking gold. So saloons leaned heavily on game meat. Wild animals hunted locally, butchered quickly, and tossed into a stew pot with whatever roots or beans were around. From jackrabbits to rattlesnakes, game meat. On the menu meant survival food, not fine dining. Let's dive deep into what was actually served, what it tasted like, and why game meat kept the Wild West full even if not exactly satisfied. Why game meat? Because that's what there was. The Wild West was full of wild animals, and not much else. Settlements were small, refrigeration was non-existent, and professional butchers were rare. Most towns didn't have steady access to farm-raised livestock. What they did have was miles of untamed wilderness filled with animals. Trappers and locals brought in whatever they could find. Deer, antelope, elk, prairie dogs, squirrels, raccoons, wild turkeys, and even mountain lion if things got weird. If it had legs and bled, it could be dinner. Saloon cooks would clean it, stew it, season it heavily, especially if it smelled strong or gamey, and serve it hot with bread or beans. Nobody asked too many questions. Meat's meat, the saying went. Venison, the king of the frontier. Stew poached venison deer meat was probably the most popular game meat on the frontier. It was lean, abundant, and familiar. Hunters could bag a deer outside of town and sell or trade the meat to a saloon for drinks, supplies, or a hot meal. Saloon kitchens often turned venison into stew. Why stew? Because the meat was tough and lean, especially from older bucks. Slow. Cooking in a big iron pot helped break it down. Add some root vegetables like onions or potatoes, if you had them. Toss in dried herbs, and bam, venison stew. If the deer was young or lucky enough to be tender, you might see it roasted or pan-fried. But most of the time, it got boiled into something that could be ladled out fast and cheap. Elk and antelope. Bigger game, bigger portions in the Rockies and Great Plains. Elk and pronghorn antelope were fair game, literally. These animals were larger than deer, which meant more meat per kill, a saloon's dream. Elk steaks were prized when fresh, but more often the meat was dried or smoked and later rehydrated for stew or hash. The taste? Gamier and richer than beef, often compared to a wild version of lamb. Antelope, on the other hand, was controversial. Some people loved its distinct flavor. Others thought it smelled too strong and tasted like old socks. It depended heavily on how it was butchered and cooked. Regardless, if a trapper walked into a saloon with elk or antelope, the cook snapped it up fast. It kept the pot full for days. Small game, rabbits, squirrels, and whatever that is. You know it's tough living when someone says, "We've got stew made from," well, you don't want to know. Small game was the backbone of many saloon menus. Jackrabbits, cottontails, squirrels, raccoons, skunks, yes, really, and porcupines were all on the culinary radar. That rabbit was the most common and acceptable. It was white meat, tender, and fairly easy to hunt. Fried rabbit, when done right, could be downright delicious. Squirrel was hit or miss. Some swore by it. Others swore at it. It was usually tossed into stew with beans or gravy and served over. Stale bread, the others, they were for hard times. Porcupine was fatty and slow-moving, which made it a desperate choice. Raccoons and skunks had to be carefully cleaned to remove scent glands or game funk. If a saloon was serving these, business probably wasn't booming. Birds on the plate, wild turkey, quail, pigeons, and even owl poultry was rare, unless you had a successful farm nearby. But wild birds? That was another story. Wild turkeys were plentiful in some regions, and their meat was a prize catch. When a hunter brought one in, the saloon might serve roast turkey with gravy, or whatever passed for gravy that day. Quail and pheasants were delicacies when fresh, often roasted whole, or fried if there was enough grease to spare. Doves and pigeons were small but packed flavor, usually baked or stewed. And yes, people did occasionally eat owl. Not popular, not tasty, and likely served only when someone was really desperate. Rattlesnake, armadillo, and other. Wait, you ate what? Meet some of the more exotic options on the menu came from the South and Southwest. Rattlesnake meat was considered a delicacy in some areas, tasting like a fishy chicken and often fried like catfish. Saloons in Texas or Arizona might fry it in strips and serve it with pickled peppers or cornbread. Armadillo, nicknamed possum on the half shell, was also eaten. Its meat was tough and bland, but it was edible when slow cooked or buried in coals. It was most common in poor or isolated towns. Other occasional and questionable meats included bobcat, badger, and coyote. Again, if it moved, someone had probably eaten it. What did it all taste like? Here's the honest answer. Not great. Game meat isn't like farmed meat. It's leaner, tougher, and has a stronger flavor. Without refrigeration, it could spoil fast, and without modern seasonings, it was hard to mask the wild taste. Bats. Why saloons turned so much of it into stew? Boiling helped kill off bacteria and masked weird smells. Heaping on onions, garlic, vinegar, and wild herbs helped even more. Fried rabbit or roast quail might be delicious, but squirrel stew or coyote. Hash? That took courage. And let's not forget presentation. Food was usually slopped onto tin plates with little ceremony. You got meat, bread, maybe beans, and a cup of black sludge coffee to wash it down. No garnish, no napkins, just grit and gravy. Who? Caught the game? Saloons didn't usually have full-time hunters. Instead, they relied on locals, cowboys, drifters, Native Americans, trappers, or anyone who showed up with fresh kill. A common deal went like this. Bring in skinned and cleaned deer, get paid in cash, food, or whiskey. It was a win-win. The hunter got warm and full, and the saloon got enough meat for a few days of meals. This system also meant that menus changed constantly. One day it might be elk stew, the next, stewed raccoon and corn mush. You never knew what was coming unless you looked in the pot. From game to gourmet. The evolution of Wild West cuisine, ironically, A lot of the game meat eaten out of desperation in saloons is now considered gourmet. Elk steaks, rabbit stew, wild boar sausage. You can find these on fancy restaurant menus today. But back then, it wasn't trendy. It was a matter of what's alive nearby, and can we eat it before it rots? Over time, as refrigeration and farming spread, game meat disappeared from saloon tables. Chickens arrived. Pigs were raised. Cows became the new kings of the menu. But in the early days of the Wild West, game meat was essential. It fed gold miners, ranch hands, outlaws, and travelers. It was rough, wild, and unpredictable, just like the West itself. The wild taste of the frontier, if you sat down in a Wild West saloon, hoping for a juicy steak, you'd likely end up chewing on something that once lived in a hole or flew into. A trap. Asterisk game meat was more than just food. It was survival. It was barter. It was a reminder that civilization was still miles away. You didn't ask where it came from. You didn't ask what it was. You just picked up your tin fork, said a quiet prayer, and dug in. Because in the Wild West, if there was game meat on the menu, that meant you were lucky, at least for one more meal. Whiskey came first, food second. Step inside, partner mutt. Don't expect a menu that's set the scene. You walk through the swinging doors of a dusty saloon in some sun-scorched frontier town like Dodge City or Deadwood. Your boots hit the creaky wooden floor. Your throat is parched, and your belly's been growling since the last watering hole 50 miles back. You glance around hoping for a bite to eat, but the bartender already knows what you really came. "Oh, whiskey?" He says, not even asking Dot, because in the Wild West, whiskey came first. Food was an afterthought. If you were lucky, they had beans on the stove. If you were really lucky, it didn't taste like old boots. And if you stuck around long enough past the drinking, the poker, and maybe a fist fight or two, you might just get something edible. Maybe. Let's dive into what saloon food really looked like in the lawless days of the American frontier, where calories came second to liquor, and dinner was something you hoped wouldn't bite back. Whiskey was the real main course. Let's not sugarcoat it. Saloons were bars first, restaurants a distant second. Liquor was the priority, and saloon owners made most of their profits from it. Cowboys, miners, outlaws, and lawmen alike came through the doors looking for one thing: a shot of courage, comfort, or both. And that whiskey? It wasn't smooth. It was gut-busting, harsh, and sometimes homemade in the back room. If it said whiskey on the barrel, there was no guarantee what was actually inside. Anything from turpentine and tobacco, juice to burnt sugar and raw alcohol could have made the cut. You didn't sip it, you braced yourself, downed it in one go, and hoped for the best. But the kicker? You were more likely to find a shot of this fiery brew than a hot plate of food. Saloon kitchens. Cramped, chaotic, and optional. Not all saloons served food. Many were nothing more than dusty bars with a few poker tables and a barrel of something flammable behind the counter. If food was available, it was likely cooked in a tiny back room or over an open fire out back. There were no health codes, no refrigeration, and certainly no Michelin stars. Cooks were often whoever could handle a skillet and didn't mind the smell. Ex-army men, widows, or down-on-their-luck gamblers filled in as makeshift chefs. They worked with what they had, which wasn't much. There were no deliveries of fresh produce. Everything was canned, dried, or salted. Even when something fresh came into town, you could bet it was old by the time it hit your plate. If there was food, it was probably beans, a go-to dish of the Wild West saloon. Beans. Lots and lots of beans. Beans were the peanut butter of the frontier, cheap, non-perishable, filling, and extremely repetitive. Whether pinto, navy, or black-eyed, they were soaked, stewed, and occasionally jazzed up with a scrap of bacon or beef fat if the cook was feeling generous. You didn't ask what kind of beans. You didn't ask how they were cooked. You were just happy to get something that didn't taste like saddle leather. Meat. A risky roll of the dice meat was available, but it wasn't always clear what kind. If you were in a big town saloon near a railhead, you might luck out with salt pork, beef, steak, or even fried chicken on a good day. But most of the time, the meat was whatever could be caught, trapped, or shot. Jackrabbit, squirrel, raccoon, prairie chicken, snake if it had legs or didn't. It was fair game. The meat was often dried into jerky, salted beyond belief, or tossed into a stew pot with onions, beans, and wild herbs. If the stew had a name like slumgullion, it was best not to ask questions. You'd probably live longer that way. Bread that could double as a weapon-fresh bread? Forget it. Most saloons didn't bake. What you got instead was hardtack, dry, hard biscuit that could survive a nuclear blast. Originally made for soldiers and sailors, hardtack became the default bread of the frontier. It was basically flour, water, and salt baked until rock solid. You'd soak it in coffee or stew just to soften it enough to chew. Cowboys called it tooth dollars for good reason. If a saloon did happen to have cornbread, soda bread, or flapjacks, consider yourself lucky. But those luxuries didn't come standard with your whiskey. Eggs were gold if you saw eggs on the hand-chalked menu board. It was either a special day, or someone in the kitchen had a very protective shotgun and a couple of chickens behind. The saloon. Eggs were a rare treat, because keeping hens in the Wild West was like inviting every fox, hawk, and hungry outlaw to breakfast. When you got them, they were usually fried in lard or scrambled beyond recognition. But they were protein, and they were real. Some saloons made egg sandwiches, usually just a slab of fried egg on dry bread. No butter, no sauce. Just the pure joy of not eating more beans. Pickled everything refrigeration didn't exist, so vinegar became a saloon's best friend. Pickled eggs, pickled onions, pickled vegetables, and even pickled pig's feet were displayed in cloudy jars on the bar. They were sour, rubbery, and aggressively salty, but they didn't spoil. And that was what mattered. Better yet, they made people thirsty, which meant more whiskey sales. Smart business. Stews. Everything in one pot, sometimes literally. One pot. Meals were the unsung heroes of the frontier kitchen. Saloon cooks would throw whatever they had into a cauldron. Beans, beef scraps, onions, herbs, and questionable mystery meat. It all simmered together, masked by enough spice or salt to hide. The Sins. Cowboys called it slumgullion, or son-of-a-gun stew. It wasn't about taste, it was about fuel. The better the cook, the less you noticed the ingredients. And if you ever found a bootlace in your bowl, just chew around it. Coffee, hot, black, and terrifying coffee, was the other main drink offered. By saloons, not that it was anything to celebrate. It was boiled in giant pots over open flames. Grounds were reused. Water was usually from the nearest stream or well, and it was often gritty. The brew was black as midnight and twice as bitter. Cowboys didn't mind. It was hot, and it kept them awake. Sugar and cream? Not unless you brought it yourself. Desserts were rare, but possible. Nobody walked into a saloon looking for cake. But if there happened to be a local woman baking for extra money or a celebration was underway, you might find molasses cookies, dried apple pie, or even a slab of spice cake. Sugar was expensive, and milk spoiled fast, so most desserts were dry, not too sweet, and made to last. Still, they were a welcome break from all the salt and vinegar. Eating was secondary to drinking. Let's not forget the big picture. The saloon existed for drinking, gambling, and carousing, not gourmet dining. The food was there because hungry. Men drink more. A pot of beans on the fire meant patrons stayed longer. played one more hand of poker, and bought another bottle. It wasn't a restaurant. It was a trapdoor to trouble with snacks. Fights broke out more often than food was served. And if a gunshot rang out during your meal, nobody flinched. They just kept chewing. What the Wild West tasted like? You ever time traveled back to the 1880s and walked into a real saloon? You'd quickly realize this wasn't the cinematic, cigar-scented paradise from Western movies. It was dirty, loud, smoky and stank of sweat, gun oil, and cheap booze. The food was basic, often bad, but it did its job. It filled bellies. It soaked up whiskey. It kept the cowboys upright for one more round of cards or one more mile on the trail dot. So next time you complain about your coffee being too weak or your burger missing avocado, just picture yourself in a dusty saloon, staring down a plate of lukewarm bean mash and a glass of firewater whiskey dot, because in the Wild West, whiskey came first. Food, if it showed up at all, was just the chaser. No refrigeration meant funky flavors. When you think of the Wild West, you probably picture whiskey shots, poker tables, spurred boots on creaky floors, and the unforgettable clang of a piano pounding away in the corner. But tucked between the gunslinging and card dealing was something far more dangerous. The food dot forget about juicy steaks, sizzling skillets, and frosty beers. Food at Wild West saloons was, let's say, unpredictable. And the biggest reason? No refrigeration, no fridges, no freezers, no cold storage. That meant funky meats, questionable stews, and aged eggs that had aged a little too much. Let's dive spoon first into the surprisingly gritty world of frontier saloon food, where flavor wasn't always your friend, and eating was sometimes an act of courage, where the meat sweated more than the men picture this. It's the middle of July, in a one-horse town in Arizona. The sun is beating down like a blacksmith's hammer, and there's no ice in sight. Now imagine a slab of beef hanging in the back room of a saloon, slowly baking in the heat and just beginning to turn a suspicious gray around the edges. That was reality. Without refrigeration, meat began to go bad fast. Cowboys and cooks did what they could, salting, drying, smoking, but nothing was foolproof in that kind of heat. Some saloons tried burying food in cellars or keeping it in cool spring water, but unless you lived near a mountain stream, you were mostly out of luck. The result? Funky meat, sour sausages, mystery stew that sometimes had more bacteria than beef. It was said that if the meat didn't kill you, the whiskey afterward probably would. The flavor of spoilage. Extra tangy, since meat spoiled so quickly. Saloon cooks got creative in covering it up. Enter the heavy use of spices, onions, vinegar, and, you guessed it, chili. That pot of beans simmering in the back corner? It wasn't just for flavor, it was a masking agent. Some chili recipes used so much chili powder, garlic, and cumin that they could make even a half-rotted chunk of meat palatable. Sort of old-timers even joked that you didn't eat saloon food to enjoy it. You ate it to sweat, burp, and get it over with butter that bit back it wasn't just the meat. Even butter and milk had a short shelf life. Without refrigeration, dairy went sour within hours, especially in summer. That meant butter could arrive yellow and creamy, and by the next morning, turn a suspicious shade of green. Some patrons were used to it and slathered it on biscuits anyway. Others got wise and started calling it frog butter. Delightful milk? Only kids and the sick dared drink it, and even they did so with a wince and a prayer. If it wasn't spoiled when you poured it, it might curdle by the time you brought it to your lips. Eggs with attitude, you might think eggs are safe. After all, they have a shell. What could go wrong? Plenty. Eggs were gathered fresh from local farms, but in many dusty towns, that meant hours or days of transport in a hot wagon. By the time they reached the saloon kitchen, they weren't exactly farm fresh. Cracked shells leaked, Bacteria seeped in, and the result? Rotten eggs with a distinct smell you'd never forget. Some saloon cooks used the old float test. If the egg floated in water, it was no good. Others skipped the test altogether and just cracked it in the pan, hoping for the best. Breakfast was a gamble, and not just at the poker table. Beans, the safer bet, sort of. If there was one thing you could count on in a saloon kitchen, it was beans. Dried beans were easy to store and didn't spoil in the heat, which made them a frontier favorite. Baked beans, pinto beans, chili beans, you name it, they made it. The only problem? Clean water. Washing beans and cooking them required water that wasn't filled with dirt, dust, or worse. If the water was contaminated, so were your beans. Still, a hot bowl of beans was better than spoiled beef or questionable sausage. And it had the added bonus of making your fellow card players clear the room an hour later. Bread that good. Break a tooth in towns where yeast and good flour were hard to come by. Biscuits and bread often came out flat, heavy, and dry as sawdust. Cooks used baking soda or sourdough starters, but without proper storage, the dough sometimes went bad before it hit the oven. Some saloons served hardtack instead of rock-hard cracker that could last for months, if not years. Soldiers and sailors ate it, and so did cowboys. But unless you soaked it in soup or coffee, it was like biting into a brick. Saloons didn't bake fresh rolls every morning. They reheated yesterday's biscuits, slapped on some frog butter, and hoped. No one chipped a tooth. Pickles to the rescue here. As a fun surprise, pickled food was one of the best things to eat in a saloon. Why? Because pickling preserved food without refrigeration. Everything from cucumbers and onions to eggs, and even pig's feet got the brine treatment. Pickled eggs in big cloudy jars sat on most saloon bars, bobbing like strange underwater creatures. They weren't pretty, but they were safe. The vinegar killed bacteria and gave everything a sharp bite. And if you were already drinking whiskey, a pickled pig's foot just felt like the right companion. Sort of coffee that could strip paint one. Way to wash it all down? Coffee. Strong, black, gritty, and often brewed from grounds that had already been used once or twice. Saloons weren't exactly Starbucks. They made their coffee in large kettles and kept it on the fire all day. It thickened, it darkened, and sometimes it grew a film on top that would make your mustache curl. But it was hot, full of caffeine, and safer than the drinking water. That was enough for most folks. After a bowl of funky stew and a crusty biscuit, a mouthful of burn-your-throat coffee was practically a dessert. The saloon cook, half chef, half gambler saloon cooks weren't fancy chefs. They were improvisers. They worked with what they had and prayed nobody died from dinner. They had no timers, no thermometers, and no guidelines. They tasted, they guessed, and they dumped in chili powder when in doubt. Some were great local legends who could turn rabbit and beans into something close to heaven. Others were, well, let's say their food was best enjoyed quickly and without looking at it too closely. It's fresh enough. Menus were more like suggestions. You might walk in asking for steak and potatoes, but end up with rabbit and beans, or goat, or possum. Sometimes the waiter would pause before answering and glance toward the kitchen, as if gauging the risk of serving whatever was still fresh. And if you really wanted to know what you were eating, you probably shouldn't have. Asked. The brave ate it anyway. The wise ordered whiskey and called it dinner. Food poisoning? Part of the package without refrigeration. Food poisoning was just part of life. Upset stomachs, sudden trips to the outhouse, or full-on sickness were all too common. But people were tough, or at least used to it. There weren't health inspectors or food safety laws. If you got sick from the chili, you might just shrug and go back the next day for more. The only alternative was cooking for yourself, and most folks weren't much better than the saloon cook. A taste of the Wild West, literally today. We romanticize Wild West saloons with their swinging doors and piano tunes. But behind the scenes, food was rough, risky, and often a little ripe. The lack of refrigeration meant that flavor wasn't always the priority survival was. Eating was a gamble, and like every good gambler, you hoped your luck held out. Still, something about it stuck. The resilience, the creativity, the unapologetic boldness of a stew that made your eyes water. That's the spirit of frontier food, and it's why Wild West saloons, for all their culinary crimes, are still remembered today. Eat fast. Drink faster in the Wild West. You didn't eat for flavor. You ate to live. And if the stew had a strange aftertaste, or the meat smelled a little off, you drank another shot of whiskey and kept chewing. The food at Wild West saloons may not have won any Michelin stars, but it told a story of grit, improvisation, and a whole lot of chili powder. So next time you crack open your fridge and pull out a cold steak or fresh milk, spare a thought for the cowboys who never had that luxury. And if you ever find yourself at a Wild West-themed restaurant, just be glad the pickled eggs aren't bobbing in a jar that's older than you, because back then, funky flavor wasn't a vibe. It was a warning. The cook was often a drunk ex-miner. When you think of the Wild West saloon, what comes to mind? Gunfights at high noon? Whiskey sliding down a bar? Piano music barely drowning out the sound of a poker game going south? That's all classic frontier fare. But there's one character who often lurks in the shadows of every dusty saloon and ramshackle dining hall, the cook. And no, he wasn't some French-trained chef flipping steaks to perfection. More often than not, the cook was a cranky, foul-mouthed, drunk ex-miner who barely knew what he was doing, and he was in charge of your dinner. Welcome to the culinary chaos of the Wild West, where food was served with a side of grit, grime, and possibly yesterday's hangover. Let's pull back the stained curtain of the saloon kitchen and meet the unlikely and sometimes unwashed characters who made it all happen. From pickaxe to frying pan, the origin of the frontier cook, the lawless, boom or bust towns of the American West. Men often came and went with the promise of gold. Mining was brutal work, and not everyone struck it rich. After a few years of lung-crushing dust and back-breaking labor, some miners gave up digging and took to flipping flapjacks. Instead, why? Simple. People needed to eat, and cooking paid. Well, something. You didn't need credentials or a resume. If you could build a fire and didn't burn beans too badly, you might be hired. If you had a cast-iron skillet, a bad attitude, and no other prospects, you were definitely hired. And thus, the Wild West saloon cook was born not out of passion for the culinary arts, but out of necessity, desperation, and maybe a little too much whiskey. The cook's kitchen was a disaster zone. Forget stainless steel countertops and gleaming appliances. The average saloon kitchen was more like a dirty lean-to behind the main bar, outfitted with a wood-burning stove, a greasy countertop, a few rusted knives, and a wash basin that hadn't been emptied since last Tuesday. Refrigeration? Nope. Food? Safety standards? What's that? It was common for raw meat to sit out for hours, flies buzzing lazily over it, while beans boiled endlessly in soot-blackened pots. Everything was cooked either in lard or over open flames, and seasoning was rarely more complex than a scoop of salt, if they had any. Still, the cook made it work. Kind of breakfast? Hope you like burnt bacon. So, what did the drunken ex-miner turned cook actually serve in a Wild West saloon? Here's a look at what was on the menu and how it was prepared, often while nursing a killer hangover. 1. Beans all day. Everyday beans were the undisputed king of the frontier menu. Pinto, navy, or black. Beans slow-boiled for hours until they were mushy enough to spoon if the cook didn't forget them, and burn the whole pot. Sometimes they were seasoned with salt pork for flavor. If the cook was feeling fancy, or sober enough to remember closing parenthesis dot two, bacon and biscuits. If there was one luxury cowboys and travelers loved, it was bacon, salty, greasy, often undercooked, but glorious when hot. Served with hard biscuits or hardtack. If no baking happened that day, it was the closest thing to a gourmet breakfast in the Wild West. And the biscuits? Imagine them dense, dry, and overbaked because the cook passed out mid-recipe. Welcome to brunch, frontier style. Point 3. Stew of mystery lunch and dinner usually meant stew whatever meat, potato, onion, or leftover veggie the saloon had on hand, thrown into a pot and simmered until it resembled gravy with attitude. One day it might be rabbit, the next day beef, if you were lucky, or possibly prairie dog. No guarantees, and no refunds. 4. Coffee strong enough to wake the dead saloon coffee wasn't brewed. It was tortured. Grounds were reused until flavor was a suggestion, and water came from whatever stream was nearby, boiled for purity, which meant nothing. The result was a thick, bitter, sometimes gritty drink that doubled as paint remover. But for the cook, that coffee was life support. After a night of drinking rot-gut whiskey and yelling at his reflection in a soup pot, he needed it to function. Barely the cook's personality. Somewhere between a troll and a poet, the frontier cook was a character gruff, crusty, foul-mouthed, and often covered in soot, but sometimes surprisingly philosophical. After all, this was a man who'd seen gold rushes, cave-ins, bar fights, and now had to deal with drunk cowboys complaining that the bacon was too chewy. He might yell at customers for breathing too loud. He might threaten to quit every morning, only to be found stirring beans an hour later. Some cursed like sailors. Others muttered to themselves in a stew-scented fog. Most had a limp, a story, or a tattoo they couldn't explain. And don't forget, they were often armed. If you dared insult the food too loudly, you might find yourself dodging a flying skillet or getting chased out with a ladle. Why was the cook always drunk? Short answer, because he could be. Whiskey was cheaper than water in some towns. Life was rough, and unlike a prospector or a lawman, the cook didn't have to ride into the hills or chase down outlaws. He had a warm stove, a daily bottle, and a job that didn't demand sobriety, just food, hot-ish, 3 times a day. In many ways, the cook was the emotional heart of the saloon, the grumbling figure who cursed the sunrise, served hangover stew, and played harmonica by the fire at night. He drank because the West was harsh. He drank because the job was thankless. He drank because everything in the Wild West was a little broken, including the cook. Hygiene? Don't ask. We've got to talk about it. Because the cook, bless him, was not winning any awards for cleanliness. Hands might not have been washed for days. Knives wiped on an apron coated in flour, grease, and unidentifiable goop. Meat cut on the same board used for chopping onions, gutting game, and maybe trimming toenails. In fact, the most dangerous part of eating in a Wild West saloon might not have been the food itself, but everything that touched it. Dysentery, food poisoning, and even botulism were real threats. But hey, at least the coffee was boiled. Probably when the cook was good. He was gold. Not every saloon cook was a disaster. Some were former camp chefs or army cooks who knew how to stretch rations and feed a crowd. A good cook, one who could make fluffy biscuits, stew that didn't taste like regret, and beans with actual seasoning was beloved, protected, even feared. A cook with skill could demand better pay, better booze, and even his own tent out back. Cowboys would follow a good cook from job to job, trusting him more than they trusted their trail boss, even when he was still a little drunk. The cook was part of the Wild West myth. He may not have worn a badge or robbed a train, but the saloon, Cook was just as much a part of the Wild West as the cowboy or outlaw. He was the man behind the scenes, feeding legends, swearing at pans, and holding the kitchen together with liquor and spite. He cooked through hangovers, fevers, fights, and food shortages. He made breakfast at dawn, lunch at noon-ish, and stew until the pot boiled dry. He did it all without glory, without recognition, and usually while arguing with a chicken. The next time you watch a Western and see a saloon full of hungry, dust-covered travelers, remember that someone, somewhere, was back there stirring beans with a greasy spoon, muttering, and pouring a splash of whiskey into the pot for flavor. Would you eat his cooking? You might gag at the hygiene. You might flinch at the mystery meat. But the cook drunk, exasperated, and surprisingly resourceful, was essential to the Wild West. He fed outlaws and lawmen, gamblers and gold miners, cowboys and con men. His food wasn't fancy, but it was hot. And in a world where you could die of snakebite or starvation before sundown, that counted for something. So here's to the unsung hero of the saloon. The man with the scorched apron, the haunted eyes, and the hangover that never went away. Because in the Wild West, food wasn't about flavor, it was about survival. And your best chance of surviving was probably cooked up by a drunk ex-miner with a frying pan and an attitude. In the Wild West, your cook probably used to swing a pickaxe, drank more than he slept, and could burn beans without trying. But he fed you, sort of. Food came in the form of beans, bacon, stews, and biscuits made with more cussing than love. And somehow, despite the grime, the chaos, and the questionable hygiene, he was the backbone of the saloon. Tough, cranky, and occasionally sober, the saloon cook got the job done. Closing article for YouTube video. What food was served at Wild West saloons? 400 words. Interesting and engaging ending. So now you know Wild West saloon food wasn't about flavor. It was about survival. It was greasy, gritty, and often barely edible. But out on the frontier, after a long day of wrangling cattle or dodging bullets, cowboys weren't asking for a 5-course meal. They just wanted something hot, something filling, and preferably something that didn't crawl off the plate. From endless pots of overcooked beans, to hardtack that could double as a weapon, to bacon fried in the same pan used to fix a wagon axle. The food was as rugged and tough as the people eating it. And let's not forget the coffee thick, black, and brewed strong enough to wake the dead, or at least the guy passed out at the poker table. Behind all of it stood the cook, usually a grizzled, half-sober ex-miner who didn't take kindly to complaints and might have seasoned your stew with a side of cigarette ash. He wasn't there to make you happy. He was there to keep you alive, one scorched biscuit at a time. But for all its rough edges, saloon food had its charm. It was the taste of the untamed West, cooked over open flames, eaten under the clatter of spurs and the creak of swinging saloon doors. It wasn't pretty, but it was real, a piece of everyday life in a world where nothing came easy. So the next time you're at a restaurant and you're tempted to send your food back because it's not cooked just right, just imagine trying to gnaw through a slab of hardtack while some outlaw is yelling about cheating at cards. At least you're not eating beans boiled in the same pot the cook used to bathe in last week. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this bite-sized look into frontier food, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more gritty, grimy, and surprisingly hilarious history from the Wild West. And drop a comment below. Would you have survived a meal in an old frontier saloon? Until next time, keep your coffee strong, your bacon crispy, if you're lucky, and never, ever insult the cook.